A brutal Chicago blizzard. A shivering 6-year-old hiding in a dark alley. When Clara stripped off her only heavy winter coat to save the child, she had no idea she was protecting the heir to the city's deadliest crime syndicate. And now the boss is hunting her down. The wind howling off Lake Michigan on the night of January 14th was merciless. Meteorologists on WGN News had been warning of the bomb cyclone for days, urging residents to stay indoors. But people like Clara Hughes didn't have the luxury of hiding from the weather. Rent in Logan Square was due, and her shifts at the Daily Crumb, a small struggling bakery on Clark Street, barely covered her heating bill. Clara was a big woman. She had always been heavy, her curves soft and wide, carrying the kind of weight that made her practically invisible to the fast-paced, image-obsessed crowds of the city. She was used to taking up space in a world that constantly told her to shrink. But tonight her size was a small blessing against the biting sub-zero wind chill. She was wrapped in her most prized possession, a massive men's 3XL black Columbia parka she'd bought at a thrift store. It wasn't fashionable, and it made her look like a walking marshmallow, but it was lined with thick fleece and shielded her broad shoulders and wide hips from the icy daggers of the storm. It was nearly 11:30 p.m. Clara was trudging down a deserted stretch of Rush Street, her heavy boots crunching through 3 inches of fresh snow. The upscale restaurants had shuttered early due to the blizzard. As she passed a narrow, unlit alleyway between a closed steakhouse and a brick parking garage, a faint sound cut through the howling wind. It sounded like a whimper. Clara paused, pulling down the thick wool of her scarf. She peered into the gloom. Nestled behind a row of frozen, overflowing dumpsters was a tiny, trembling shadow. "Hello," Clara called out, her voice trembling. The shadow flinched. Clara took a step closer, pulling her phone out to use the flashlight. The beam illuminated a sight that made her heart drop into her stomach. It was a little girl no older than 6. She was severely underdressed for a blizzard, wearing nothing but a torn burgundy velvet party dress, thin white tights, and a single black patent leather Mary Jane shoe. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks with melting snow, and her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. "Oh, sweetheart." Clara gasped entirely, forgetting her own exhaustion. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees in the filthy snow. "What are you doing out here? Where are your parents?" The little girl shoved herself further against the brick wall, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. Daddy said to run," he said. "Hide and don't make a sound." Clara's maternal instincts, buried under years of loneliness, flared to life. She didn't know what kind of horrific situation this child had run from, a domestic dispute, an abusive home, or worse. All Clara knew was that this tiny body was shutting down from the cold. Without a second thought, Clara unzipped her massive Columbia parka. The freezing wind instantly sliced through her thin, flour-stained grey cardigan, biting into the flesh of her arms and chest. She shuddered, her teeth instantly beginning to clack, but she ignored the pain. She wrapped the giant coat around the little girl. The 3XL jacket swallowed the child whole, wrapping around her twice like a heavy, insulated sleeping bag. There," Clara soothed, pulling the thick hood over the girl's dark hair. The coat smelled of Clara, a warm, comforting mix of vanilla extract cinnamon and cheap coffee. "I've got you. You're safe. My name is Clara. What's yours?" Lily," the girl whispered, burying her freezing face into the fleece lining of Clara's coat. "Okay, Lily. I'm going to call the police, okay? They'll get you somewhere warm." Clara reached into her jeans pocket for her phone, her thick fingers already growing numb and clumsy in the blistering cold. Before she could dial 911, the roar of heavy engines shattered the quiet of the street. 3 massive black Cadillac Escalades with tinted windows came screeching around the corner of Rush Street, their tires slipping dangerously on the ice before slamming to a halt right in front of the alley. The doors flew open. Clara froze in sheer terror. 6 massive men in dark overcoats poured out of the vehicles. They weren't police. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized aggression, and the moonlight caught the unmistakable gleam of firearms drawn and ready. "Check the alley." One of the men roared, his voice rough and commanding. "If the Rossi family got to her, I'll burn this whole damn block to the ground." Lily gasped from inside the oversized coat. "Daddy's men." Clara's mind short-circuited. Guns, suited men, the Rossi family. She read the Chicago Tribune. She knew the rumors about the organized crime syndicates that still bled the city in the shadows. This wasn't a domestic dispute. This was the Mafia. Panic, primal and overwhelming, seized Clara's chest. She was a nobody, a baker who struggled with her weight and her rent. If these armed men thought she was trying to hurt the girl, they would shoot her where she stood. "Stay here," Clara whispered frantically, her breath visible in panicked white clouds. She didn't wait to grab her coat. She didn't wait to explain. Clara scrambled to her feet, her heavy body moving with a desperate, adrenaline-fueled agility she didn't know she possessed. She sprinted toward the opposite end of the alley, slipping on the ice, her thin cardigan doing absolutely nothing against the brutal wind. "Hey, stop right there!" A deep voice shouted behind her. Clara didn't look back. She bolted down a side street, ducking into the labyrinth of service alleys, her lungs burning her exposed skin, stinging as the blizzard swallowed her whole. Arthur Costa didn't panic. Panic was for weak men. And the head of the Costa syndicate had built his empire on cold, calculated brutality. But when he saw the bullet-riddled wreckage of his daughter's escort vehicle an hour ago on Wacker Drive, something inside his chest had splintered. Now, standing in the freezing alley off Rush Street, surrounded by his heavily armed enforcers, Arthur's terrifying composure was hanging by a thread. Boss, his right-hand man, a scarred enforcer named Dominic, yelled from the shadows of the dumpsters. "We found her. She's alive." Arthur shoved past his men, his $4,000 tailored Italian suit ruined by the snow. He dropped to his knees, his heart finally restarting as he saw Lily. She was sitting in the snow perfectly safe, completely swallowed up by a ridiculously massive, cheap black winter coat. "Lily, mio Angelo." Arthur breathed, pulling his daughter into his arms, coat and all. He checked her frantically for blood, for injuries, but she was just shivering. "I ran Daddy just like you said," Lily whimpered, clinging to his neck. "The bad men didn't find me." "I know, baby, I know. You did so good," Arthur whispered fiercely, pressing kisses to her cold forehead. He pulled back his sharp, dark eyes, narrowing as he took in the massive garment she was wrapped in. It was a men's 3XL. It was worn frayed at the cuffs and smelled strongly of vanilla and baked sugar. "Where did you get this coat, Lily?" "The soft lady." Lily said, her voice muffled by the thick collar. "She gave me her warm hug. But then she got scared and ran away." Arthur's gaze snapped to the end of the alley, where a set of heavy, hurried footprints disappeared into the drifting snow. Someone had found his daughter completely defenseless, and instead of calling the police or taking advantage, they had literally given her the coat off their back in a deadly blizzard. Arthur stood up, lifting Lily effortlessly into his arms. He looked at Dominic, his expression hardening into stone. "Take my daughter to the safe house, then find out who owns this coat. I don't care what it takes. Hack the street cameras, track the footprints. You find her." 3 days later, Clara was paying the price for her good deed. She was standing behind the counter at the Daily Crumb, violently stifling a sneeze into a paper napkin. Losing her winter coat meant she had walked a mile to the nearest L train station in a thin sweater during a historic freeze. She had caught a vicious chest cold, her nose was bright red, and she was miserable. Worse than the cold was the sickening anxiety. She couldn't afford a new coat. She had spent the last 2 days wearing 3 layers of cheap sweaters, feeling painfully self-conscious about how bulky and ridiculous she looked. Clara already hated drawing attention to her body. Being fat in a city full of sleek, wealthy professionals was exhausting enough. Now she felt like a walking target of pity. "You look terrible, Clara," her manager, an older woman named Patty, said sympathetically as she arranged a tray of blueberry muffins. "You should have stayed home." "Can't afford it, Patty." Clara croaked, her voice raspy. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, resting her aching back against the counter. Besides the oven, heat feels good. Outside the mid-morning street was quiet, the city still digging out from the snow. Clara was just about to box up a dozen croissants when the bell above the bakery door violently jingled. The heavy oak door was pushed open, and the temperature in the room seemingly dropped 10 degrees. 4 men walked in. They were massive, their shoulders practically filling the doorway. They wore dark, tailored overcoats over sharp suits, their faces devoid of any warmth. One of them immediately walked to the front windows and flipped the open sign to closed, pulling down the blinds. Patty gasped, dropping a pair of tongs. Clara froze her heart, hammering wildly against her ribs. She recognized the terrifying, imposing aura immediately. It was them, the men from the alley. Then the crowd of giants parted, and Arthur Costa stepped forward. He was devastatingly handsome, but in a cruel, sharp way. High cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with dark stubble, and eyes so dark they looked like polished obsidian. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of an apex predator. He stopped in front of the display case, his eyes sweeping over the tiny bakery, before locking on to Clara. Clara felt a flush of deep, humiliating heat rise in her cheeks. She knew what he saw. A heavy, red-nosed, frantic woman in an apron covered in powdered sugar. She felt her weight instantly, an uncomfortable burden under his piercing, evaluating stare. Arthur looked at her for a long, silent moment. He had expected to find a typical opportunist, maybe a hustler looking for a reward, or some sleek socialite who had stumbled into the wrong alley. Instead, his men had tracked the thrift store tag and the security footage to this plump, trembling baker with terrified, wide hazel eyes. Arthur reached into a high-end matte black shopping bag he was holding and pulled something out. He dropped it onto the glass display counter. It was Clara's beat-up 3XL Columbia parka. "Is this yours?" Arthur asked. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the quiet bakery. Clara swallowed hard, her throat burning. Yes. Yes, it is." "My men told me you ran from them," Arthur said, taking a slow step closer to the counter. He didn't look angry. He looked intensely curious. "Why?" "Because they had guns!" Clara blurted out, her fear overriding her filter. She immediately clamped her mouth shut, her cheeks burning hotter. I'm sorry. I just wanted to help the little girl. I didn't know anything. I didn't see anything. Please don't hurt me." Arthur's dark eyes softened by a fraction of a millimeter. He looked at her flour-stained hands, at the 3 layers of cheap sweaters she was wearing to stay warm, and then back up to her flushed, plump face. "Hurt you?" Arthur repeated softly, the words rolling off his tongue like a promise. You stripped down in sub-zero weather to keep my daughter from freezing to death. You sacrificed your own warmth for a stranger's child." He signaled to Dominic with a subtle flick of his wrist. Dominic stepped forward, carrying a massive, sleek garment bag bearing the logo of an ultra-exclusive Italian designer. Dominic unzipped it and laid the contents carefully on the counter. Clara's breath hitched. It was a winter coat, but not just any coat. It was a breathtaking floor-length parka made of crushed black velvet, lined with genuine, ethically sourced Arctic fox fur. It was a masterpiece of tailoring screaming wealth and luxury. "I ran a background check on you, Clara Hughes," Arthur said smoothly, watching her shock. "I know you work double shifts. I know you struggle with your rent. And I know you don't have another coat." I can't accept this," Clara stammered, stepping back, her insecurities flaring wildly. "It's too much. And it won't fit me. I'm a big girl. Designer clothes don't make my size." A ghost of a smirk played on Arthur's lips. It was a dangerous, thrilling expression. "I don't deal in off-the-rack, Clara," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming startlingly intimate. "I had my tailor work overnight. It was made exclusively for your measurements. I suggest you put it on." Clara stood frozen. She looked at Patty, who was cowering near the espresso machine, too terrified to speak. With shaking hands, Clara reached out and touched the fur. It was unimaginably soft. "Why are you doing this?" Clara whispered, looking up into the eyes of Chicago's most feared Mafia boss. Arthur leaned forward, his large, scarred hands resting on the glass counter. He was so close, Clara could smell his expensive cologne cedar smoke and danger. "Because in my world, Clara kindness is the rarest currency," Arthur murmured, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "You saved what belongs to me, and the Costa family always protects its investments." He paused, his dark eyes darkening with a sudden possessive intensity. "And from this moment forward, Clara, you belong to me." "I belong to no one," Clara said, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm. The air in the Daily Crumb grew dangerously thick. Patty whimpered from behind the espresso machine, but Clara held Arthur Costa's gaze. She was terrified, yes. Her knees were shaking beneath her worn denim jeans, and her heart felt like a trapped bird in her chest. But Clara had spent 30 years being pushed around, ignored and talked down to because of her size and her bank account. She wasn't about to become a Mafia boss's pet project. Arthur didn't blink. The dangerous smirk on his lips merely shifted into a look of profound, terrifying respect. "We'll see," Arthur murmured smoothly. He tapped the glass counter, once turned on his heel, and walked out the door. His massive enforcers followed silently, leaving the stunning, custom-made velvet coat resting over the pastry display. Clara thought that was the end of it. She thought she had called the bluff of Chicago's most dangerous man. She was dead wrong. That evening, Clara took the Blue Line train back to her cramped apartment in Logan Square. She carried the heavy garment bag with her, intending to figure out a way to return it. As she trudged up the 3 flights of stairs, the hallway smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. She unlocked her door, flipped on the light switch, and froze. Her tiny apartment had been utterly destroyed. The cushions of her thrifted sofa were slashed open, stuffing scattered across the floor like fresh snow. Her bookshelf was overturned, her kitchen cabinets ripped from their hinges. Before Clara could even scream, a rough hand clamped over her mouth from the shadows behind the door. A cold metallic barrel pressed against her temple. "You're the fat bitch who hid the Costa brat, aren't you?" A raspy voice hissed in her ear. The Rossi family sends its regards." Tears streamed down Clara's full cheeks. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the gunshot. Crash. The apartment door was kicked entirely off its frame. Clara was suddenly yanked backward as the man, holding her violently, jerked a choked gargle escaping his throat before he slumped to the floor. Clara fell to her knees, gasping for air. Dominic Arthur's scarred right-hand man stood in the doorway, a silenced pistol in his hand. Two other suited men swept into the apartment, checking the corners with terrifying efficiency. "Get up, Miss Hughes," Dominic said, his voice clipped and urgent. "The Rossi syndicate tracked the police scanners. They know you intervened. You aren't safe here." Within 10 minutes, Clara was bundled into the back of an armored Mercedes SUV speeding down Lakeshore Drive. The city lights blurred through her tears. She was shivering not from the cold, but from the realization that her quiet, invisible life was over. The SUV pulled into the secure underground garage of the Palmolive building, one of the most exclusive and heavily guarded high-rises on the Gold Coast. Clara was escorted up a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the frozen lake and the glittering Chicago skyline. Arthur was waiting in the living room, pouring a glass of amber liquid at a wet bar. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick, corded forearms etched with dark ink. "I told you," Arthur said, quietly handing her the glass of bourbon. "The Costa family protects its investments. The Rossis put a bounty on your head. Until I dismantle their operation, you stay here." Clara took a shaky sip of the burning liquor. She looked around the immaculate, ultra-modern space, and then down at herself. She was wearing an oversized grey sweater covered in flour dust, her wide hips and thick thighs feeling agonizingly out of place in this world of sleek leather and polished marble. "I don't fit in here, Arthur," Clara whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm just a baker. Look at me. I'm fat. I'm clumsy. I'm nobody. Why are you risking a gang war over me?" Arthur set his glass down. He crossed the room, his dark eyes fixed entirely on her. He didn't stop until he was inches away. Gently, his large, calloused hands reached up, cupping her face and wiping the tear away with his thumb. "Look at you," Arthur repeated, his voice dropping into a dark, rough whisper that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "I am looking at you, Clara. The men in my world surround themselves with starving plastic women who would sell my daughter to the highest bidder for a diamond necklace. You are real. You are soft, you are warm, and you have a heart braver than half the soldiers on my payroll." He leaned in his lips, brushing the shell of her ear. "Never apologize for the space you take up, Clara, because I intend to worship every single inch of it." For 2 weeks, Clara lived in the velvet cage of the penthouse. It was a surreal existence. She spent her mornings baking in Arthur's state-of-the-art chef's kitchen, filling the cold, masculine apartment with the scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh focaccia. Her afternoons were spent with Lily, who adored Clara, clinging to her wide waist and calling her the soft lady. Arthur was a man of intense contradictions. By day, he was the ruthless boss commanding an empire from his study. By night, he sat at the kitchen island eating Clara's pastries and listening to her talk about her dream of opening her own bakery. He looked at her with a heavy, possessive hunger that made her pulse race, treating her with a reverent gentleness that terrified her far more than his guns did. But Clara was observant. Years of blending into the background had taught her how to watch people, and she began to notice something deeply wrong with Arthur's cousin Dante. Dante was a sharp-featured, nervous man who served as one of Arthur's top lieutenants. He visited the penthouse frequently to give updates on the war with the Rossi family, but Clara noticed the way Dante's eyes darted around the room. She noticed how he always excused himself to the balcony to take personal calls on a burner phone he kept hidden in his left breast pocket. The missing puzzle piece clicked into place on a snowy Tuesday evening. Clara was braiding Lily's hair in the living room, while Dante and Arthur spoke in hushed tones near the foyer. "Uncle Dante smells like the bad alley," Lily whispered, suddenly wrinkling her nose. Clara froze. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "The night I ran away," Lily said innocently. "The bad men from the Rossi family. They smelled like sweet smoke and peppermint. Uncle Dante smells just like them today." Clara's blood ran cold. She remembered the distinct scent of cherry pipe tobacco and peppermint oil, a highly unusual combination. She remembered Dante telling Arthur that the Rossi ambush on Lily's escort car had been a surprise attack. But how could it be a surprise if Dante carried the scent of the very men who had ambushed them? That night after Dante left and Lily was put to bed, Clara walked into Arthur's study. He was staring at a map of the city, looking exhausted. "Arthur," Clara said softly. He looked up, the tension in his jaw immediately softening. "You should be asleep, mia cara." "It's Dante," Clara said, stepping fully into the room. She didn't flinch. She stood tall, letting her heavy frame occupy the space with confidence. "He's the leak. He set up the ambush on Lily. He's working with the Rossis." Arthur went perfectly still. His eyes turned flat dead and utterly terrifying. "Those are heavy accusations, Clara." "Dante is my blood. He uses a burner phone he hides in his left pocket." Clara pushed forward, trusting her instincts. "And Lily recognized his scent. He smells like the men who attacked her car. He's feeding them your movements, Arthur. That's why you can't get a step ahead of them." Silence stretched in the room, thick and suffocating. Arthur stared at her for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Dominic," Arthur said coldly. "Bring Dante to the warehouse on Kinsey Street. Check his left pocket." He hung up. He didn't say another word, simply walking past Clara and out of the apartment. Clara didn't sleep that night. She paced the hardwood floors, terrified she had made a mistake, terrified she had just signed a man's death warrant. When the sun finally crested over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in bruised purples and pinks, the front door opened. Arthur walked in. He looked drained. His knuckles bruised his white shirt, stained with a few drops of dark crimson. He stopped in the center of the living room, looking at Clara. "You were right," Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "He sold us out to take my place. They were planning to hit this penthouse tomorrow." Arthur suddenly dropped to his knees, right in front of her, wrapping his arms around her thick waist and burying his face into her stomach. He let out a long, ragged exhale. The invincible Mafia boss was crumbling, seeking refuge in her warmth. Clara instinctively ran her hands through his dark, thick hair, holding him tightly. "You saved my daughter," Arthur whispered against her. "And now you've saved me. You are my queen, Clara, my partner, and I will burn this city to ash before I let anyone touch you." Months later, the Chicago underworld was quiet. The Rossi family had been systematically dismantled, and the Costa Syndicate reigned supreme. But the real talk of the town wasn't the violence. It was the grand opening of the Velvet Crumb, a luxurious, massive bakery in the heart of the Gold Coast. Standing behind the marble counter was Clara. She wasn't wearing a cheap, oversized sweater. She was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored crimson dress that hugged her gorgeous, full curves perfectly. She radiated power, warmth, and an untouchable confidence. The bell above the door jingled. Arthur walked in, holding Lily's hand. He bypassed the line of wealthy patrons walking straight behind the counter to pull Clara into a deep, claiming kiss. She was Clara Costa now. She had given a shivering child her coat, and in return, she had been given a kingdom. Do you think Clara made the right choice by stepping into Arthur's dangerous world to protect him and Lily? The line between right and wrong blurs when family is involved. If you loved this intense Mafia romance twist, hit that like button and share it with your friends who love a fierce, confident heroine. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic storytelling